Dr. Richard Hayes had been working as a cancer doctor for 23 years. In all that time, he thought he had seen everything. He had watched patients fight and win. He had watched others fight and lose. He had held the hands of strangers as they took their last breath, and he had delivered news that changed families forever. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for what was about to happen in room 412. It was a cold Tuesday evening in November. The hospital was quieter than usual. Most of the day's staff had gone home, and the night shift was just settling in. Richard stood in the hallway outside room 412 holding a clipboard with papers he did not want to sign. He had been standing there for almost 10 minutes. Unable to make himself walk through the door, inside that room was a 74-year-old woman named Eleanor Webb. She had been his patient for almost 2 years now. When she first came to him, the cancer was in her lungs. It was serious, but there was hope. They tried everything: chemotherapy, radiation, experimental treatments. For a while, it seemed like they were winning. Eleanor even started talking about going home, about seeing her garden again, about playing with her grandchildren. But cancer does not always follow the rules. 6 months ago, it came back. This time, it spread fast. First to her bones, then to her liver, then 2 places Richard did not even want to think about. Every scan brought worse news. Every treatment failed. And now, after 2 years of fighting, Eleanor was lying in that hospital bed with nothing left to try. Richard looked down at the papers in his hands. They were the forms to move her to hospice care. Comfort care, they called it. It meant they were giving up on curing her and focusing only on making her comfortable until the end. It was the right thing to do. He knew that. But signing those papers felt like admitting defeat. And Richard Hayes hated losing. He had always been that way, even as a young boy. His mother used to say he was the most stubborn child she had ever seen. If he started something, he finished it. If someone told him something was impossible, he took it as a personal challenge. That stubbornness had served him well in medical school. It had helped him become one of the best oncologists in the state. But it also made moments like this unbearable. He thought about the first time he met Eleanor. She had walked into his office with her daughter, a woman in her 40s who looked terrified. But Eleanor herself seemed calm. She sat down across from him, looked him straight in the eye, and said something he would never forget. "Doctor, I have lived a good life. A full life. I am not afraid of dying, but I am not ready to go just yet. So let us see what we can do." That was Eleanor. Practical, direct, strong in a way that had nothing to do with physical strength. Over the months of treatment, Richard had gotten to know her well. He learned that she had been married to her husband for 48 years before he passed away. He learned that she had 3 children and 7 grandchildren who visited her every Sunday without fail. He learned that she loved crossword puzzles, old movies, and chocolate cake. But there was something else about Eleanor that Richard had noticed from the very beginning. Something he could not quite put into words. Whenever she sat by the window in her room, her fingers would move in a strange way. They would tap against her leg or the armrest of her chair in patterns that seemed almost musical. He had asked her about it once early in her treatment. "Old habit," she had said with a small smile. "Pay no attention." He had not pressed further. There were always more important things to discuss. Test results, treatment plans, side effects. The little mystery of her tapping fingers had faded into the background of everything else now, standing in that hallway. Richard realized he might never get the chance to ask her about it again. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The room was dim. Only the small lamp beside the bed was turned on, casting a warm circle of light across Eleanor's face. She looked smaller than she had just a week ago. The cancer was taking everything from her now, even the simple weight of her body. Her cheeks were hollow. Her skin had taken on that pale, almost transparent quality that Richard had seen too many times before. It was the look of someone whose time was running out, but her eyes were open. And when she turned to look at him, there was still something alive in them. Something that had not given up, even if her body had.
"At Hayes,"
she said. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but she managed a small smile. I was wondering when you would come by. Richard walked over to the chair beside her bed and sat down. He set the clipboard on the small table, face down so she would not see what was on it. Not yet. How are you feeling tonight, Eleanor? She laughed softly. It was a tired sound, but genuine. Like a woman who has been fighting a war for 2 years, exhausted but still here. Richard nodded. He did not know what to say. In all his years of doing this job, he had never figured out the right words for moments like this. How do you tell someone that you have run out of options? How do you tell them that the fight is over? Eleanor seemed to sense what he was thinking. She had always been good at reading people. It was one of the things he admired about her. Came to talk about what happens next, she said. It was not a question. Richard let out a slow breath. Your family has been notified. The hospice team is ready whenever you are. We can make sure you are comfortable, Eleanor. We can make sure there is no pain. He expected her to be upset, or scared, or angry. Those were the reactions he usually saw. But Eleanor just looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes. I appreciate everything you have done for me, Doctor. I truly do. You fought harder for me than anyone could have asked. Richard shook his head. I did not fight hard enough. If I had caught it sooner the second time, if I had tried a different combination of treatments, maybe. Stop, Eleanor said gently. You did everything right. This is not your failure. This is just life and death. They go together, whether we like it or not. Richard did not respond. He could not. There was a lump in his throat that would not go away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft beeping of the monitors and the distant noise of the hospital going about its business. Life continuing on, even in this room where it was slowly coming to an end. Then Eleanor turned her head and looked out the window. The city lights spread out below them, twinkling against the dark sky. Her fingers began to move again, tapping against the blanket in that same strange pattern. Dr. Hayes, she said, still looking out at the night. I have one request before I go. Richard leaned forward. Anything, Eleanor? Whatever you need. She turned back to face him, and in her eyes, he saw something he had not expected. Not fear, not sadness. Something fiercer. Something almost like hope. There is a piano in the chapel downstairs, she said. I would like to play it. Just once more? Richard stared at her. Of all the things he had expected her to ask for, this was not one of them. A priest, maybe? More time with her grandchildren? A phone call to an old friend. But a piano? You play piano? He asked. And for the first time in weeks, Eleanor Webb smiled in a way that made her look like a completely different person. Like someone who had lived a life full of secrets and wonders he knew nothing about. Doctor, she said softly. I have not even begun to tell you my story. Richard sat back in his chair, completely caught off guard. In 2 years of knowing Eleanor Webb, he thought he had learned everything important about her. He knew about her family. He knew about her late husband. He knew she loved chocolate cake and old movies. But a piano? That was something she had never mentioned. Not once. I do not understand, he said slowly. You want to play the piano? Now. Eleanor nodded. Her eyes had a light in them that Richard had not seen in months. It was strange. Here was a woman who could barely lift her own hand to drink water. And yet she was talking about playing an instrument like it was the most natural thing in the world. I know what you are thinking, she said. You are thinking that I have lost my mind, that the medication is making me confused. But I promise you, doctor, I am thinking more clearly right now than I have in a very long time. Richard did not know how to respond. He had dealt with many unusual requests over the years. Patients who wanted to see the ocean one last time. Patients who wanted to call someone they had not spoken to in decades. One man had even asked Richard to help him write a letter to his estranged son. But this was different. This was not just emotionally difficult, it was physically dangerous. Eleanor, he said carefully, choosing his words. I want to help you. I really do. But you have to understand your condition. Moving you out of this bed, taking you downstairs, letting you sit at a piano, it could be too much for your body. It could speed things up. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. It was a soft, gentle laugh, full of warmth rather than bitterness. Speed things up? She repeated, "Doctor, look at me. I have maybe days left, perhaps a week, if I am lucky. What exactly am I protecting myself for?" Richard opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. She was right. He knew she was right. And yet every instinct he had as a doctor was screaming at him to say no. To keep her safe, to follow the rules. "Tell me something," Eleanor said, her voice growing softer. "In all your years of doing this work, have you ever just sat with a dying patient and asked them what they really wanted? Not what their family wanted. Not what the hospital wanted. What they wanted." Richard thought about it. The honest answer was no. There was always too much to do. Too many forms to fill out. Too many other patients waiting. The system did not leave much room for sitting and asking questions that did not have medical answers. "I thought so," Eleanor said, reading his silence. "You are a good man, Dr. Hayes. A good doctor. But you have spent so long trying to save people that you have forgotten something important. Sometimes people do not need to be saved. Sometimes they just need to be heard." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. He looked down at his hands, suddenly feeling very tired. "Why'd you never tell me you played piano?" he asked quietly. Eleanor smiled, and for a moment she looked like a much younger woman. Like someone looking back on a life filled with beautiful memories, "because it was not relevant to my treatment," she said. "And because, I suppose I was not ready to talk about it. It was too painful." "Painful?" Eleanor turned her gaze back to the window. The city lights reflected in her eyes like tiny stars. "I was a concert pianist," she said, "for over 40 years. I started playing when I was 5 years old. My mother had an old upright piano in our living room. It was out of tune and missing a key, but to me, it was the most magical thing in the world. I would sit at that piano for hours, just pressing the keys and listening to the sounds they made." Richard listened in silence. He had learned long ago that the best thing a doctor could do sometimes was simply listen. By the time I was 10, my teacher said I was the most talented student she had ever taught. By 15, I was performing in front of audiences. By 25, I had played in some of the greatest concert halls in the world. She paused, and her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I even played at Carnegie Hall. Twice." Richard stared at her. Carnegie Hall. He was sitting next to someone who had performed at Carnegie Hall, and he had never known. All those months of treatment, all those conversations about test results and medication schedules, and he had never once thought to ask her about her life before the cancer. "What happened?" he asked. "Why did you stop?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with old grief. "My husband," she said. "He got sick about 10 years ago. Not cancer. His heart, it happened slowly at first, then all at once. He needed me. Our children needed me. So I stopped performing. I stopped practicing. I told myself it was temporary, that once he got better, I would go back to it." She did not need to finish the sentence. Richard already knew. Her husband had not gotten better. After he passed, I could not bring myself to play anymore. Every time I sat down at a piano, I thought of him. The way he used to sit in the front row at all my concerts. The way he would bring me flowers backstage, even after 40 years of marriage. The music was too connected to him. Playing felt like losing him all over again. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He thought about his own wife at home. About how he sometimes worked late just to avoid the silence of an empty house. About how easy it was to let the things you loved slip away when life got hard. "So you have not played in 10 years?" he asked. "Almost 11, Eleanor said. And then I got sick, and there was no time to think about music. There was only time to fight. But now?" She looked down at her hands, at the thin fingers that had once danced across piano keys in front of thousands of people. "Now the fight is over. And I realized something, lying here in this bed, staring at these walls." "What did you realize?" Eleanor looked up at him, and there were tears in her eyes now. But they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of something else. Something that looked almost like relief. "I realized that I had been so afraid of the pain that I forgot about the joy. The music was not just about my husband. It was about me. It was the thing that made me feel most alive. And I let it go because I was scared. She reached out and took Richard's hand. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were strong. I do not want to die being scared, doctor. I want to die remembering who I was, who I really was. Richard looked at this woman, this small, fragile woman who had lived a life bigger than he could have imagined. He thought about the rules, the protocols, the forms waiting to be signed. And then he thought about what she had said, about how sometimes people just needed to be heard. The chapel piano, he said slowly. It has not been tuned in years. It probably sounds terrible. Eleanor smiled through her tears. I have played on worse. And if something happens, if your body cannot handle it, then I will have died doing the thing I loved most. That is not a tragedy, Dr. Hayes. That is a gift. Richard looked at her for a long moment. Everything in his training told him to say no, to protect her, to follow the rules that had guided his entire career. But something else was speaking louder now, something that had nothing to do with medicine. Okay, he said quietly. Let me see what I can do. Eleanor squeezed his hand. And for the first time since he had walked into her room, Richard felt like he was actually helping her. He had no idea that what happened next would change his life forever. Richard left Eleanor's room that night with his head spinning. He walked down the quiet hallway of the hospital, past the nurse's station, past the other rooms where other patients were sleeping, and he kept asking himself the same question over and over. What was he doing? He was a doctor. He had spent his entire adult life following rules. Rules existed for a reason. They kept patients safe. They kept doctors out of trouble. They kept the whole system running the way it was supposed to run. And now, here he was, seriously considering breaking those rules for a dying woman who wanted to play a piano in the middle of the night. It was crazy. He knew it was crazy, but he also knew something else. He knew that Eleanor was right. In all his years of treating patients, he had focused so much on keeping them alive that he had sometimes forgotten to ask what they were living for. He had measured success in blood counts and scan results and survival rates. But what about the things that could not be measured? What about dignity? What about joy? What about giving someone the chance to feel like themselves one last time before they were gone? Richard stopped walking. He was standing in front of the elevator now, staring at the closed metal doors. The chapel was 3 floors down. He had passed it hundreds of times over the years, but had never really paid attention to it. It was just a small room with some chairs and a few religious symbols on the walls. And in the corner, if he remembered correctly, there was an old grand piano that nobody ever played. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened and he stepped inside. His finger hovered over the button for the ground floor. One push, and he would be on his way to see if this was even possible. One push, and he would be crossing a line he could never uncross. He pushed the button. The chapel was dark when he arrived. He found the light switch and flipped it on. The room was smaller than he remembered. About a dozen wooden chairs were arranged in neat rows, facing a simple wooden cross on the wall. And there in the corner, covered with a layer of dust, was the piano. Richard walked over to it slowly. It was a grand piano, old but still beautiful. The black wood had faded to a dark gray in some places, and the keys had yellowed with age. He pressed one of them gently. The sound that came out was slightly off, a little flat, but it was still clearly a piano. Still capable of making music, he stood there for a long time, just looking at it. Then he made his decision. Getting Eleanor down here would not be easy. He would need help. And he would need to do it without anyone official finding out. If the hospital administration learned what he was planning, there would be consequences. At best, a formal reprimand. At worst, he could lose his license. 23 years of work. It's gone because he wanted to let a dying woman play a song. But some things were more important than careers. Some things were more important than rules, Richard. He knew exactly who to ask for help. There were 2 nurses who had been caring for Eleanor since she was admitted. They had been with her through the good days and the bad days. They had held her hand during the painful treatments. They had sat with her when her family could not be there. If anyone would understand what he was trying to do, it would be them. He found them at the nurses' station on Eleanor's floor. Linda was in her 50s, a veteran nurse who had seen everything and was not easily shocked. Grace was younger, maybe 30, but she had a kindness about her that made patients feel safe. They both looked up when Richard approached. "Dr. Hayes," Linda said. "Is everything all right with Mrs. Webb?" Richard looked around to make sure no one else was listening. Then he leaned in closer and lowered his voice. "I need to ask you both something, and I need you to hear me out before you say no." He told them everything. About Eleanor's request, about her past as a concert pianist, about the piano in the chapel and what he was thinking of doing. When he finished, both nurses were staring at him with wide eyes. "You want to move her out of her room?" Grace said. "Tonight?" "I know how it sounds," Richard said. "Believe me, I know. But you have both spent time with her. You know who she is. You know what this would mean to her?" Linda was quiet for a moment. She had been a nurse for almost 30 years. She had seen doctors do a lot of things, good and bad, but she had never seen one risk his career for something like this. "If something goes wrong," she said slowly, "we could all be in serious trouble." "I know," Richard said. "And I am not asking you to do this. I am just asking if you would be willing to help. If you say no, I understand completely. I will figure out another way." The two nurses looked at each other. Something passed between them, some unspoken communication that Richard could not quite read. Then Linda turned back to him. "What time were you thinking?" Richard felt a wave of relief wash over him. 10 o'clock. "After the shift change? The hallways will be quieter then." Grace nodded slowly. "The service elevator on the east side. It goes straight down to the chapel level. We can avoid most of the main areas that way. And the night security guard," Linda added. "His name is Howard. He is a good man. If we explain what we are doing, I think he will look the other way." Richard could not believe what he was hearing. These two women, who had everything to lose, were willing to help him break every rule in the book. For Eleanor. For a dying woman they had come to care about. "Thank you," he said. "Both of you. I do not know how to thank you enough." Linda smiled, but there was something serious in her eyes. "Do not thank us yet, Doctor. We still have to actually do this." The next 3 hours were the longest of Richard's life. He went back to his office and tried to do paperwork, but he could not focus. He kept looking at the clock, watching the minutes tick by. 9 o'clock. 9:15. 9:30 at 9:45. He made his way back to Eleanor's room. Linda and Grace were already there, preparing her for the move. They had disconnected her from the monitors and wrapped her in warm blankets. Eleanor looked up at Richard when he walked in, and her eyes were shining. "You actually did it," she whispered. "I was not sure you would," Richard smiled. "Neither was I." Moving her was harder than he expected. Eleanor weighed almost nothing, but her body was so fragile that every movement had to be careful and slow. They lifted her from the bed to a wheelchair that Grace had brought. Linda tucked the blankets around her, making sure she was warm. Richard stood close, watching her face for any sign of pain or distress. "Are you all right?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. "Better than all right. I feel like I am going on an adventure." They moved through the darkened hallways like thieves in the night. The hospital was quiet, most of the patients asleep, most of the staff busy with their own work. When they reached the service elevator, Richard pressed the button and held his breath. The doors opened. Empty. They wheeled Eleanor inside and started the descent to the chapel level. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the elevator and Eleanor's quiet breathing. When the doors opened again, they were in a back hallway that Richard had never seen before. Grace led the way, pushing the wheelchair, while Linda walked beside Eleanor, holding her hand. Richard followed behind, his heart pounding in his chest. They passed the security desk. Howard, the night guard, looked up from his newspaper. He saw the wheelchair, the nurses, the doctor. He saw Eleanor wrapped in her blankets, looking smaller and more fragile than any patient he had ever seen. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Howard nodded once, slowly, and looked back down at his newspaper. They kept walking. The chapel doors were just ahead now. Richard moved forward and pushed them open. The room was dark, but the moonlight coming through the stained glass windows cast soft colors across the floor. Blues and reds and golds. Falling across the wooden chairs and the dusty piano in the corner, they wheeled Eleanor inside, and she gasped softly. She breathed, "It is beautiful." Richard looked around the room, seeing it through her eyes. The moonlight, the colors, the waiting piano. It was beautiful. He had just never noticed before. They helped Eleanor out of the wheelchair and onto the piano bench. It took all three of them, moving slowly and carefully. Her body was so weak that she could barely hold herself upright. But when her fingers touched the keys, something changed. She straightened her back. She lifted her chin. And for just a moment, she was not a dying woman in a hospital gown. She was a concert pianist, sitting at her instrument. Ready to perform, Richard stepped back and waited. Eleanor closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first note that came from the piano was soft, almost hesitant, like a voice that had been silent for too long and was not sure it still remembered how to speak. Eleanor's fingers trembled above the keys, and for a moment Richard was afraid that this had all been a mistake, that her body was too weak, that the dream she had carried all the way down to this chapel was going to fall apart before it even began. But then came the second note, and the third, and slowly something began to change. Eleanor's fingers found their rhythm. The hesitation faded. The trembling stopped. And the music that began to fill that small chapel was unlike anything Richard had ever heard in his life. She was playing.
Oh.
Richard did not know much about classical music, but he recognized the piece. It was one of those melodies that everyone has heard at some point, even if they do not know its name. A nocturne. Soft and sad and beautiful, all at the same time. The kind of music that makes you think about things you have lost, and people you have loved, and moments you wish you could live again. Richard stood frozen by the chapel door, unable to move. Beside him, Linda had her hand pressed over her mouth. Grace was crying silently, tears running down her cheeks without making a sound. None of them had expected this. They had expected something nice, maybe, something sweet. A dying woman playing a few notes on an old piano. A touching moment to remember. But this was not just nice. This was not just sweet. This was something else entirely. Eleanor played like the piano was part of her body. Her fingers moved across the keys with a grace and precision that seemed impossible for someone in her condition. Just hours ago, she could not hold a cup of water. Now, her hands were dancing, flying, creating sounds that filled every corner of the room and seemed to reach straight into Richard's chest. He thought about what she had told him earlier, about playing at Carnegie Hall, about performing in front of thousands of people. He had believed her, of course. But believing something and seeing it are two different things. Now he was seeing it. Now he understood that Eleanor Webb was not just someone who played piano. She was someone for whom music was as natural and necessary as breathing. The nocturne continued, each phrase flowing into the next, like water in a stream. The old piano, which Richard had worried would sound terrible, seemed to come alive under her touch. Yes, some of the notes were slightly out of tune. Yes, the sound was not perfect. But somehow that made it more beautiful, not less. It was real. It was human. It was a woman saying goodbye to the thing she loved most in the world. Richard did not realize. He was crying until he felt the tears on his face. He was not the only one. At some point during the music, other people had begun to gather at the chapel doors. A patient in a wheelchair, still wearing his hospital gown. A young woman with a bandage on her head, holding onto an IV pole for support. Two more nurses who must have heard the sound from the hallway. Even Howard, the security guard, had left his desk and was standing at the back of the room. His newspaper forgotten. No one spoke. No one moved. They just stood there, listening, as this fragile old woman poured her entire soul into an instrument. She had not touched in over a decade. Eleanor's eyes were closed. Tears were streaming down her face, but she did not stop playing. Her body swayed gently with the music, and there was an expression on her face that Richard could only describe as peace. Pure, complete peace. like she had finally found something she had been searching for her whole life. The nocturne built slowly toward its climax. The notes grew more intense, more passionate, more alive. Eleanor's fingers moved faster now, drawing sounds from the piano that seemed almost impossible. The music swelled and filled the room, filled the hallway, filled every empty space with something that felt almost sacred. And then, just as suddenly, it began to soften. The final phrases of the piece were gentle again, quiet, like a whisper at the end of a long conversation. Eleanor played each note with such tenderness that it almost hurt to listen. She was not just playing music anymore. She was saying goodbye. To the piano, to the life she had lived, to everyone she had ever loved, and everything she had ever been. The last note hung in the air for a long, long moment. Then it faded into silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Eleanor sat perfectly still at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, her eyes still closed. The tears were still falling down her cheeks, but she was smiling. A real smile. The kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep inside, from a place that has nothing to do with happiness or sadness, but something bigger than both. Richard was the first to move. He walked slowly across the chapel floor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He knelt down beside the piano bench and took Eleanor's hand in his. He stopped. He did not have words. There were no words for what he had just witnessed. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at him. Her face was exhausted, completely drained, but her eyes were brighter than he had ever seen them. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me be myself one last time." Richard shook his head. "No. Thank you. Thank you for showing me what I had forgotten." "And what is that?" Richard thought for a moment. He thought about all the years he had spent in hospitals, fighting against death, measuring his worth by how many patients he could save. He thought about the forms he filled out and the protocols he followed and the rules he never questioned. "That medicine is not just about keeping people alive," he said slowly. "It is about helping them live." Eleanor squeezed his hand. Her grip was weak, barely there, but it meant everything. Behind them, the small crowd that had gathered began to move. Some of them were wiping their eyes. Others were just standing in silence, still trying to process what they had experienced. The young woman with the bandage on her head approached the piano slowly. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," she said, her voice breaking. "Who are you?" Eleanor smiled at her. "Just an old woman who loves music." "No," the young woman said. "You are much more than that." One by one, the others came forward. The patient in the wheelchair, the nurses. Even Howard, who looked like he had not cried in 20 years, but was definitely crying now. They thanked Eleanor. They touched her hand. They told her how much her music had meant to them. Even though they had only heard a few minutes of it, Richard watched all of this from the side of the room. He thought about how strange life could be. How you could work in a place for years and never really see the people around you. How a dying woman could teach you more about life in one night than you had learned in 2 decades of medical school. It took almost an hour to get Eleanor back to her room. She was completely exhausted now, barely able to keep her eyes open. But even as they wheeled her back through the quiet hallways, even as they lifted her gently back into her hospital bed, she was still smiling. "Dr. Hayes," she said, just before she drifted off to sleep. "Promise me something." "Anything," Richard said. "Promise me you will remember tonight. Not just what I played, but what it felt like. Promise me you will carry that with you." Richard nodded. "I promise." Eleanor closed her eyes. Within moments, her breathing had slowed to the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. Richard sat in the chair beside her bed for a long time, watching her rest. He thought about the hospice papers still waiting on the table. He thought about the medical reality of her situation, the cancer that had spread through her body, the odds that were stacked against her. But he also thought about what he had seen tonight, the way her fingers had come alive on those keys, the way she had transformed from a dying patient into something magnificent, the way music had given her something that medicine never could, and for the first time in his long career, Dr. Richard Hayes began to wonder if everything he believed about life and death might be wrong. He had no idea that in the morning, He would find out just how wrong he had been. Richard did not sleep that night. He sat in his office, staring at the wall, replaying the events of the evening over and over in his mind. The music, the tears, the look on Eleanor's face when she played that final note. It all felt like a dream, like something that could not have really happened. But it had happened. And now he had to figure out what came next. The hospice papers were still on his desk. He picked them up and looked at them for a long time. Everything in his medical training told him to sign them. Eleanor's condition was terminal. Her body was failing. The scans did not lie. The numbers did not lie. She had days left, maybe a week at most. That was the reality. But something felt different now. Something he could not explain. He put the papers back down without signing them the next morning. Richard went to check on Eleanor before his rounds. He expected to find her weak and exhausted, paying the price for the previous night's adventure. What he found instead made him stop in the doorway, unable to believe his own eyes. Eleanor was sitting up in bed, not propped up by pillows. Actually sitting up on her own, without any support. She was looking out the window at the morning sun, and there was color in her cheeks that had not been there in weeks. "Good morning, doctor," she said, turning to smile at him. Her voice was stronger than it had been in months. Richard walked slowly into the room, his mind racing. "How do you feel?" "Strange," Eleanor admitted. "I feel strange. Like something has shifted inside me. I cannot explain it. But for the first time in a very long time, I do not feel like I am dying." Richard did not know what to say. He checked her vital signs. Her blood pressure was better. Her heart rate was steady. Even her breathing seemed easier, less labored. None of it made sense. He ordered new tests. Blood work, scans, everything they had done before. He told himself not to get his hopes up. He told himself that this was probably just a temporary improvement, a brief rally before the end. He had seen it happen before. Sometimes the body gathered its last strength for one final push before giving out completely. But when the results came back 3 days later, Richard had to sit down. The cancer was still there. He had not expected it to disappear, but something had changed. The tumors had stopped growing. Some of them had even started to shrink. Just slightly, but enough to show up on the scans. Enough to make the other doctors look at the results twice. 3 times, 4 times, convinced there must be some mistake. There was no mistake. Over the following weeks, Eleanor continued to improve. Slowly at first, then faster. She started eating again. She started walking with help, then without help. The color returned to her face. The light returned to her eyes. And every day she asked the same question. "Can I go to the chapel today?" Richard always said yes. She played piano every single day, sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for an hour or more. Word spread through the hospital about the old woman in room 412 who played like an angel. Patients started requesting to be moved to rooms closer to the chapel, just so they could hear her. Nurses scheduled their breaks around her playing times. Even doctors who had nothing to do with Eleanor's case found excuses to walk past the chapel doors when she was performing. The hospice papers stayed unsigned on Richard's desk, gathering dust. 2 months after that night in the chapel, Eleanor was discharged from the hospital. Her daughter came to pick her up, crying tears of joy that she had never expected to cry. Her grandchildren made a banner that said, "Welcome home, Grandma," in big, colorful letters. Richard walked her to the front entrance himself, something he had never done for any patient in 23 years. "I do not understand it," he told her as they waited for her daughter's car. "Medically, what happened to you should not be possible. The cancer was everywhere. Your body was shutting down. And now," he shook his head. "I have no explanation." Eleanor smiled at him with those wise, knowing eyes. "Maybe some things do not need a medical explanation. Dr. Hayes, maybe some things just need a reason to keep going." Richard thought about that for a long time after she left. In the months that followed, he found himself changing. He started spending more time with his patients, asking them about their lives instead of just their symptoms. He learned that the man in room 308 had been a jazz musician before his stroke. He learned that the woman in room 215 had written 3 novels that were never published. He learned that everyone who came through his hospital had a story, a history, a piece of themselves that had nothing to do with their illness. He started a program. It was small at first, just an idea he pitched to the hospital administration, a way to bring music, art, and other creative activities to patients who wanted them, a way to help people feel like themselves, even when their bodies were failing them. He expected resistance. He expected people to tell him it was a waste of resources, that hospitals were for medicine, not music. Instead, they said yes. The program grew. Other hospitals heard about it and wanted to start their own versions. Richard was invited to speak at medical conferences, sharing the story of the dying woman who asked to play piano one last time. He always got emotional when he told it, no matter how many times he repeated the words. "I went to medical school to learn how to save lives," he would say. "But Eleanor taught me that sometimes saving a life is not about fighting death. It is about giving people a reason to live." Eleanor stayed in touch with him over the years. She sent him letters, handwritten on beautiful stationery, telling him about her grandchildren and her garden and the piano she had bought for her living room. She played every single day, just as she had promised herself she would. She performed at local recitals, small gatherings where she shared her gift with anyone who wanted to listen. She lived for 11 more years after that night in the chapel, 11 years that no doctor could explain. 11 years that defied every scan and every statistic and every medical prediction. 11 years of music and family and sunrises and all the small, beautiful moments that make up a life. When she finally passed, it was peaceful. She was at home in her own bed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her daughter told Richard that on her last night, Eleanor had asked them to open the window so she could hear the birds singing outside. She had smiled, closed her eyes, and slipped away without any pain. At her funeral, they played a recording of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece she had performed that night in the hospital chapel, the same piece that had changed everything. Richard sat in the back of the church, listening to the music, remembering the woman who had taught him the most important lesson of his career. Tears rolled down his face, but he was smiling. After the service, Eleanor's daughter approached him. She was holding a small envelope. "My mother wanted you to have this," she said. "She wrote it months ago, just in case." Richard opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single piece of paper with Eleanor's handwriting on it. "Dear Dr. Hayes," it read. "Thank you for breaking the rules. Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving me back my music and my life. I hope you never stop asking your patients what they really need. Sometimes the answer will surprise you. With love and gratitude, Eleanor." Richard folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. Close to his heart, he kept it there for the rest of his life, and every time he walked past a piano, he thought of her. The dying woman who asked to play one last time, the woman who reminded him what it truly meant to heal. Some people come into our lives and leave footprints on our hearts. Eleanor Webb did not just leave footprints. She left music, and that music never stopped playing.